My name is Robert Big Jim Thompson, and I'm 81 years old. For 37 years, I've carried a secret that changed everything I thought I knew about family, sacrifice, and what it truly means to be human. In 1987, I was working as a timber foreman in the remote forests of northern Idaho when a creature that shouldn't exist came crashing through the trees, desperate and terrified, carrying his dying child in his massive arms. What happened in the hours that followed revealed a bond between father and son that transcended species, and a capacity for love and gratitude that put my own understanding of humanity to shame. The government buried this story so deep that everyone involved was threatened into silence, but now as I face my final years, I know the world needs to hear about the day a Bigfoot father taught me what it really means to be a man. Before that, I continue. Subscribe to the channel and comment down below where you're watching from. It was September 15th, 1987, and I was 51 years old, working as a timber foreman for Clearwater Logging Company in the remote wilderness of northern Idaho. I'd been in the logging business for 28 years, starting as a green kid with a chainsaw and working my way up to supervising crews in some of the most isolated forests in the Pacific Northwest. The work was hard, dangerous, and often lonely, but it was honest work that paid well and allowed me to provide for my family back in Coeur d'Alene. The operation I was running that fall was deep in the Selkirk Mountains, about 40 miles northeast of Sandpoint, in country so remote that we had to helicopter in supplies and equipment. We were harvesting old-growth timber from a section that had been designated for selective cutting, taking only the largest, most valuable trees while leaving the forest ecosystem largely intact. It was delicate work that required experienced crews and careful planning to minimize environmental impact. My team consisted of 12 men, all veterans of the timber industry, who understood both the value of the forest and the necessity of the harvest. We lived in a temporary camp of prefabricated buildings and trailers, connected to the outside world only by radio and the weekly helicopter supply runs. The nearest town was over 60 miles away down logging roads that became impassable in bad weather. I'd been working in remote locations for most of my career, and I thought I knew everything there was to know about forest wildlife. I'd encountered bears, mountain lions, wolves, and every other predator that called the Northern Rockies home. I understood their behavior, respected their territory, and knew how to coexist with them safely. But nothing in my experience had prepared me for what came crashing out of the trees that Tuesday morning. I was inspecting a section of road that our dozers had cut the previous week, checking for erosion, and making sure our environmental protocols were being followed properly. The morning was crisp and clear, with that particular quality of light that only exists in high mountain forests, golden shafts filtering through the canopy, illuminating the mist that rose from the forest floor. The air was thick with the scent of pine resin, damp earth, and the clean smell of snow from the peaks above us. I was alone about a quarter mile from the main camp when I heard something that made every hair on my body stand up. It wasn't quite human, but it wasn't animal either. A sound of pure desperation and anguish that seemed to come from the very soul of whatever was making it. It was the sound of a parent in distress, and I recognized it instantly, despite never having heard anything like it before. The sound was getting closer, accompanied by the crash of something large moving through the forest at tremendous speed. Trees were snapping, branches breaking, and the ground was actually vibrating under my feet from the impact of whatever was approaching. My first thought was landslide or maybe a wounded grizzly, and I started looking for cover or an escape route. Then he burst through the tree line. At first, my brain simply refused to process what I was seeing. The creature was enormous, easily 8.5 feet tall, with shoulders broader than any human could possess and arms that hung nearly to his knees. He was covered in dark brown fur that was matted with sweat and what looked like blood, and his face was a mixture of human and something else entirely. Intelligent eyes set in features that were both familiar and alien. But what stopped my heart was what he was carrying. Cradled in his massive arms was a smaller version of himself, clearly his child, maybe 4 feet tall, covered in lighter brown fur that was soft and downy like a human baby's hair. The young one was unconscious, its breathing shallow and labored, and I could see immediately that it was dying. The father, because there was no doubt in my mind that's what he was, looked directly at me with eyes that held a depth of intelligence and desperation that was unmistakably human. He made a sound that was part growl, part sob, and part something that I somehow understood was a plea for help. Then he did something that changed my life forever. He knelt down and gently placed his child on the ground in front of me, stepped back, and made a gesture that was universal across all species. He was asking me to help his son. I stood there for what felt like hours, but was probably only seconds, trying to process what was happening. Everything I thought I knew about reality was crumbling around me. These creatures weren't supposed to exist, and even if they did, they certainly weren't supposed to be intelligent enough to seek help from humans. But the evidence was right in front of me. A desperate father who had somehow recognized that I might be able to save his child's life. The young one was in bad shape. His breathing was rapid and shallow. His skin was hot with fever, and there was a deep gash on his left leg that was clearly infected. But what worried me most was his color. Beneath the fur, his skin had a grayish pallor that I recognized from my years of wilderness first aid training. He was going into shock, and without immediate medical attention, he would be dead within hours. I looked up at the father, who was watching my every movement with an intensity that was almost overwhelming. His massive hands were clenched into fists, and I could see the tremendous effort it was taking for him to remain still while a stranger examined his child. The trust he was showing by allowing me near his son was extraordinary, especially given what I would later learn about his species' relationship with humans. "Okay, big guy," I said quietly, not sure if he could understand my words, but hoping my tone would convey my intentions. "I'm going to try to help him, but I need to get him back to camp where I have medical supplies." The father tilted his massive head, clearly trying to understand what I was saying. I pointed toward the camp, then made a carrying gesture, trying to communicate that I needed to move his son. The response was immediate and terrifying, a low growl that seemed to come from somewhere deep in his chest, and a posture that suggested he was ready to tear me apart if I made the wrong move. But then he looked down at his child, saw the labored breathing and the grayish pallor, and made a decision that must have gone against every instinct he possessed. He stepped aside and gestured for me to proceed. I've carried a lot of things in my life, logs, equipment, injured men, but nothing ever felt as precious or as fragile as that young creature as I lifted him in my arms. He was surprisingly light for his size, maybe 60 pounds, and his fur was incredibly soft. But what struck me most was how human he felt, the weight distribution, the way his head rested against my shoulder, the small sounds he made as I carried him. The walk back to camp was the longest quarter-mile of my life. The father followed about 10 feet behind me, close enough to intervene if he thought I was threatening his child, but far enough back to avoid spooking me into dropping his son. I could feel his eyes on me with every step, and I knew that one wrong move would result in my death. But I also felt something else, a strange sense of honor at being trusted with something so precious to another intelligent being. This creature had overcome what must have been centuries of evolutionary programming that told him humans were dangerous, and he had placed his child's life in my hands. The weight of that responsibility was almost overwhelming. When we reached the camp, my crew was scattered across the work site, and I realized I had to make a decision that would affect all of our lives. I could try to hide what was happening, treat the young one in secret, and hope the father would disappear back into the forest. Or I could trust my men with the truth and hope they would react with the same compassion I was feeling. I chose trust. "Tommy!" I called out to my assistant foreman, Tommy Rodriguez, a 40-year-old veteran logger who had been with me for over a decade. "I need you and the medical kit in my trailer right now. And Tommy, what you're about to see stays between us. Understood?" Tommy came running, took one look at what I was carrying, and stopped dead in his tracks. His face went through a series of expressions: shock, disbelief, fear, and finally the same recognition I had felt. This was a child in need of help, regardless of what species he belonged to. "Jesus Christ, Jim," Tommy whispered. "Is that—" "It's a kid who's going to die if we don't help him," I said firmly. "That's all that matters right now." The father had stopped at the edge of the camp, clearly reluctant to come closer to the human structures and the scent of machinery and diesel fuel, but his eyes never left his son, and I could see the internal struggle he was going through, every instinct telling him to flee, but parental love keeping him rooted in place. Inside my trailer, Tommy and I worked with the efficiency that comes from years of dealing with logging accidents and wilderness injuries. The young creature's leg wound was severely infected, probably from some kind of metal debris he had stepped on. His fever was dangerously high, and he was showing signs of dehydration and blood poisoning. We cleaned the wound with antiseptic, applied antibiotic ointment, and bandaged it properly. I gave him children's aspirin to reduce the fever and used an IV kit from our emergency supplies to get fluids into him. It was basic field medicine, but it was what he needed to stabilize his condition. Throughout the treatment, the young one remained unconscious, but his breathing gradually became less labored and his color began to improve. Tommy and I worked in silence, both of us acutely aware that we were participating in something unprecedented in human history, providing medical care to a member of a species that officially didn't exist. After about 2 hours, the young creature's eyes fluttered open. They were large and dark, with an intelligence that was startling in someone so young. He looked around the trailer with curiosity rather than fear, taking in the strange surroundings with the adaptability of childhood. When his gaze fell on me, he made a soft sound that was clearly a question. I smiled and spoke to him gently, the same way I would talk to any frightened child. "You're going to be okay, little guy. Your dad brought you here because you were hurt, but you're getting better now." He tilted his head, clearly trying to understand my words, then made a series of soft vocalizations that sounded almost like language. Tommy and I exchanged glances. This wasn't just intelligence we were seeing, but actual communication attempts. "Jim," Tommy said quietly, "I think he's trying to talk to us." That's when we heard the sound from outside, a low, musical call that was obviously the father checking on his son. The young one's face lit up with recognition, and he tried to sit up, calling back in the same musical language. I helped him to his feet, supporting him as he tested his injured leg. The bandage held, and while he was obviously still weak, he was able to walk with assistance. Together, Tommy and I helped him outside to reunite with his father. What happened next is something I'll remember for the rest of my life. The father saw his son walking and alive, and the sound he made was pure joy, a deep, resonant call that seemed to come from his very soul. He knelt down and gathered his child in his arms, holding him gently while examining the bandages and medical care we had provided. His massive hands traced the clean bandages, felt his son's cooler forehead, and checked his improved breathing. Then he looked at me, and I saw something in his eyes that I had never expected to see from a creature that was supposed to be a mindless animal. Gratitude. Deep, profound, unmistakable gratitude. He stood up, still holding his son, and did something that brought tears to my eyes. He bowed. Not a casual nod, but a formal, respectful bow that acknowledged what we had done for his family. Then he reached into what appeared to be a pouch made of woven plant fibers and pulled out something that he placed on the ground between us. It was a carving, a piece of wood that had been shaped with incredible skill into the figure of a human and a creature working together. The detail was extraordinary, showing not just artistic ability, but a sophisticated understanding of symbolism and meaning. It was a gift, but more than that, it was a message, a recognition of the bond that had been formed between our species through an act of compassion. The father made a series of vocalizations that were clearly directed at me, and while I couldn't understand the words, the meaning was unmistakable. He was thanking me, promising something, making some kind of commitment that transcended language barriers. Then he and his son disappeared into the forest as silently as they had arrived, leaving Tommy and me standing in the camp with a wooden carving and the knowledge that everything we thought we knew about the world had just changed forever. But that wasn't the end of the story. It was just the beginning. Over the following weeks, strange things began happening around our camp. Equipment that broke down was mysteriously repaired overnight. Dangerous trees that threatened our work areas were found felled in the morning, cut with a precision that exceeded anything our chainsaws could achieve. Food appeared in our camp, wild game that had been cleaned and prepared, edible plants arranged in neat piles, fresh fish from streams we hadn't even known existed. It took us a while to realize what was happening. The father was repaying his debt. He was using his knowledge of the forest and his incredible physical capabilities to help us in ways that made our work safer and more efficient. He was protecting us, just as we had protected his son. But the most remarkable discovery came 3 weeks after the initial encounter. I was working alone again, checking on a section of road, when I heard that familiar musical call from the forest. I looked up to see the father approaching, but this time he wasn't alone. The young one was with him, walking on his own, clearly recovered from his injuries. What happened next changed my understanding of intelligence, communication, and the possibility of genuine friendship between species. The young one approached me directly, showing no fear of humans despite his recent trauma. He looked up at me with those large, intelligent eyes and made a series of sounds that were clearly an attempt at human speech. It took me a moment to realize what he was trying to say, but when I understood, it nearly brought me to my knees. "Thank you." The words were distorted by his different vocal structure, but they were unmistakably English. Somehow, in the 3 weeks since our encounter, he had learned enough human language to express his gratitude. The intelligence required for that kind of rapid language acquisition was staggering, but that wasn't all. The father had brought something else, a series of carved wooden tablets covered with symbols that were clearly a form of writing. Through a combination of gestures, drawings in the dirt, and the young one's growing English vocabulary, they began to communicate more complex ideas. What they revealed over the following months was extraordinary. They weren't just isolated individuals, they were part of a larger community that had been living in the remote wilderness for generations. They had their own language, their own culture, their own history that stretched back thousands of years. They had been watching human civilization develop, learning from us but remaining hidden because they understood the danger that contact would bring. The father's name, as close as I could pronounce it, was something like Stonewalker. His son was Little Stream. They were part of a family group that included Stonewalker's mate, his elderly parents, and 2 other children. They lived in a settlement about 10 miles deeper in the mountains, in caves that had been modified and expanded over generations into a complex underground community. But what impressed me most was their moral code. They had rules about interaction with humans that were based on careful observation of our behavior over centuries. They would help humans who showed kindness and respect for the forest, but they would defend themselves against those who posed threats to their community or their environment. Stonewalker had violated these rules when he brought Little Stream to me for help. Contact with humans was forbidden, except in the most extreme circumstances, and he had risked exile or worse by revealing their existence to outsiders. But parental love had overridden cultural prohibition, and he had chosen to save his son's life regardless of the consequences to himself. The decision to continue contact with me was made by the entire family group after extensive discussion. They had observed my behavior, my respect for the forest, my treatment of my crew, and they had decided that I could be trusted with their secret. But they also made it clear that this trust came with responsibilities. I was to tell no one about their existence without their permission. I was to protect their territory from unnecessary human intrusion. And I was to serve as a bridge between their community and the human world, helping them understand the changes that might affect their survival while learning from their knowledge of sustainable living in harmony with the natural environment. For the next 6 months, I lived a double life. During the day, I supervised logging operations and managed my crew. But in the evenings and on weekends, I would venture deeper into the forest to visit Stonewalker's family and learn about their way of life. Their community was unlike anything I had ever imagined. They had achieved a level of sustainability that human civilization had never approached, living in complete harmony with their environment while maintaining a complex social structure and rich cultural traditions. They had art, music, philosophy, and technologies that were based on principles completely different from human approaches. Their medicine was based on plant knowledge that had been accumulated over thousands of years. They could treat injuries and illnesses with natural remedies that were often more effective than anything in our first aid kits. Their understanding of forest ecology was so sophisticated that they could predict weather patterns, animal migrations, and seasonal changes with uncanny accuracy. But most remarkably, they had achieved something that human societies had struggled with for millennia: true equality and cooperation. Their decisions were made by consensus, with every member of the community having a voice regardless of age or gender. Conflicts were resolved through discussion and mediation rather than force. Resources were shared according to need rather than accumulated for individual benefit. Little Stream became my teacher and translator, his young mind absorbing English at an incredible rate while helping me understand the complexities of his people's language and culture. Through him, I learned that their community was one of several scattered across the Pacific Northwest, connected by a communication network that allowed them to coordinate their activities and share information about human activities that might affect their territories. They had been aware of our logging operation from the moment we arrived in their territory. They had observed our work, assessed our environmental practices, and determined that we posed no immediate threat to their core habitat. But they had also prepared contingency plans for dealing with us if our activities became too destructive or if we discovered their existence. Stonewalker's decision to seek my help had changed everything. For the first time in their recorded history, they had made peaceful contact with humans and found that cooperation was possible. The success of this contact was being discussed by communities across the region, and there was growing interest in the possibility of more formal relationships with carefully selected humans. But there were also those who opposed any contact with humans, viewing our species as inherently destructive and untrustworthy. The debate within their communities was intense, and I began to understand that my relationship with Stonewalker's family was part of a larger experiment that would determine the future of human-creature relations. The experiment came to an abrupt end in March of 1988, 6 months after the initial encounter. I arrived at camp one Monday morning to find federal agents waiting for me. They had somehow learned about my relationship with the creatures, and they wanted answers. The interrogation that followed was unlike anything I had experienced. Hours of questions about what I had seen, what I knew, what the creatures had told me about their communities and capabilities. Agent Patricia Walsh was the lead investigator, a woman in her 40s with the kind of cold efficiency that suggested extensive experience with classified operations. She made it clear that the creatures represented a potential national security threat and that any information about them was classified at the highest levels. "Mr. Thompson," she said during one of our sessions, "you've been in contact with an unknown species that possesses intelligence and capabilities that could pose a significant threat to human safety and security. Everything you've learned about them is now classified information, and any attempt to share that information with unauthorized persons will result in federal prosecution." The agents had been monitoring the area with satellite surveillance and had detected anomalous heat signatures and movement patterns that suggested the presence of large, intelligent creatures. They had also intercepted radio communications from our camp that included references to unusual wildlife activity and unexplained assistance with operations. But what really concerned them was evidence that the creatures possessed advanced knowledge of human technology and social structures. The repairs they had made to our equipment showed understanding of mechanical principles that suggested they had been studying human technology for some time. Their ability to avoid satellite detection while maintaining surveillance of human activities indicated sophisticated knowledge of our capabilities and limitations. These beings represent either a significant opportunity or a significant threat, Agent Walsh explained. Until we understand their intentions and capabilities better, all contact with them must be controlled and monitored by appropriate authorities. The federal takeover of the situation was swift and comprehensive. My logging operation was shut down under various environmental pretexts. My crew was transferred to other projects, and I was reassigned to a desk job in Coeur d'Alene with strict instructions to avoid the area where I had made contact with the creatures. But the most heartbreaking part was that I was forbidden from saying goodbye to Stonewalker and his family. The last time I saw them was during a clandestine meeting arranged by Little Stream, who had somehow learned about the federal interest and had come to warn me. "They know about us," he said, in his carefully learned English. "Father says we must go away now, find new home where skywatchers cannot see us." The family was preparing to abandon their ancestral territory and migrate to more remote areas where they could avoid government detection. Generations of history, sacred sites, and cultural connections to the land would be lost because their act of compassion toward a human child had exposed them to a threat they couldn't defend against. "Tell your people," Stonewalker said through Little Stream's translation, "that we tried to build bridge between our kinds, but your leaders fear what they do not understand. Maybe someday, when your people learn wisdom to match your cleverness, we can try again." The wooden carving he had given me after I helped his son was confiscated by federal agents, along with all my notes and photographs from our interactions. Officially, none of it had ever happened. The creatures didn't exist. Our friendship was a fantasy, and the knowledge I had gained about sustainable living and interspecies cooperation was classified beyond my security clearance. I was required to sign non-disclosure agreements that carried severe criminal penalties for violation, and I was warned that any attempt to discuss my experiences would result in federal prosecution and potential threats to my family's safety. For 37 years I've kept that promise of silence. I returned to conventional logging work, eventually retiring to a small cabin near the original site of my encounter with Stonewalker's family. I've spent decades wondering what happened to them, whether they found safety in their new territory, whether Little Stream grew up to become a bridge builder like his father, or whether the fear and suspicion of both species made such cooperation impossible. But I've also spent those years applying the lessons they taught me about sustainable living, environmental stewardship, and the importance of cooperation over competition. The knowledge they shared about forest ecology, natural medicine, and sustainable resource management has guided every decision I've made about how to live in harmony with the natural world. Now at 81, I know my time is running short, and I can't take this secret to my grave. The world needs to know that intelligence takes many forms, that consciousness exists beyond human experience, and that cooperation between species is not only possible but essential for the survival of all life on Earth. Stonewalker and his family taught me that being human isn't about species. It's about compassion, sacrifice, and the willingness to help those in need, regardless of how different they might appear. When that desperate father came crashing through the trees carrying his dying son, he showed more trust and courage than most humans ever display. And when he continued to help us even after we had helped him, he demonstrated a level of honor and gratitude that put our own understanding of reciprocity to shame. The government will deny this story, just as they've denied countless others like it. They'll claim it's fiction, fantasy, the delusions of an old man living alone in the woods. But I have the memories. I have the scars from that day when I carried a dying child through the forest, and I have the knowledge that was passed down to me by beings whose wisdom exceeded our own. Somewhere in the remote wilderness of North America, Stonewalker's people continue their quiet existence, living in harmony with the natural world, while watching human civilizations struggle with problems they solved thousands of years ago. They're waiting, as they've always waited, for a time when our species might be ready to learn from their example rather than fear their differences. Little Stream would be middle-aged now, probably with children of his own. I hope he remembers the human who helped save his life, and I hope he's teaching his own children that cooperation between species is possible when it's based on mutual respect and genuine compassion. The carving Stonewalker gave me was more than just a gift. It was a symbol of what could be achieved when intelligence chooses cooperation over conflict, when consciousness recognizes itself in other forms, when love transcends the boundaries of species and culture. That symbol was confiscated and classified, but the truth it represented lives on in everyone who chooses compassion over fear, cooperation over competition, understanding over prejudice. The bridge between our species may have been burned by government paranoia and institutional fear, but the foundation for rebuilding it still exists in the hearts of individuals willing to see beyond surface differences to the consciousness that connects all intelligent life. Stonewalker and Little Stream taught me that being human isn't about what species you belong to. It's about how you treat those who are different from yourself, how you respond to those in need, and whether you choose to build bridges or walls when faced with the unknown. That lesson is their gift to humanity, and it's a gift that's more needed now than ever before. If you made it this far, leave a comment and subscribe. It helps stories like this continue to be told.